The Detroit wind in the winter of 1924 didn't whistle. It clawed. It came slicing off the Great Lakes, thick with factory grit and the promise of despair, searching for cracks in coats and souls alike. In a cramped, cold-water flat on the city's working-class west side, a boy of 11 named Jimmy Hoffa listened to that wind. But more intently, he listened to the silence that had settled over his home. His father, a hard-drilling coal miner from Indiana, was gone. Not dead, but vanished, unable to shoulder the weight of a family during the grinding economic slump that had hit long before the rest of the country would call it a depression. The silence was broken by the sound of his mother packing a small, frayed suitcase. She was a resilient woman, her face lined with worry but set with determination. "We're going to Indianapolis, James," she said, using his proper name. Her voice was quiet but firm, a blade cutting through the chill. "Your aunt has work. We have family there. This city." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Detroit had taken its pound of flesh. But for Jimmy, Detroit wasn't just a city of loss. It was a classroom. In the years before his father left, he'd seen the man come home exhausted, covered in black dust, his pay often shortchanged by company weighing tricks. He'd heard the muttered conversations about bosses and breaks and the raw deal of a man who traded his strength for a pittance. That lesson, the lesson of exploitation, sank deeper than the cold. Indianapolis offered a reprieve, but not an escape. By 14, Jimmy was done with school. The theories in books were meaningless against the hard arithmetic of an empty cupboard. He found work as a stock boy at a Kroger grocery warehouse. The job was brutal. Long hours, heavy lifting, foremen who paced like prison guards, and a wage that seemed to shrink between the pay envelope and the rent collector's hand. One sweltering summer afternoon, the foreman, a man with a perpetually red face, tossed a stack of invoices onto Jimmy's already overloaded hand truck. "Move it, kid." Clock's ticking. The load was unstable, purposefully so. As Jimmy maneuvered it, the top boxes teetered and crashed to the concrete floor, spilling canned goods. The foreman was on him in an instant, his finger jabbing the air. "That comes out of your pay. You careless little." Something in Jimmy snapped. It wasn't anger at the insult, but at the injustice. The load was impossible. The deduction would mean no dinner for 2 days. He straightened up, not to his full height. He was still a small, wiry teenager, but with a startling intensity. He didn't shout. He looked the red-faced man directly in the eye, his voice low and gritted with a conviction that seemed too old for his face. "That load was a setup, and you know it," Jimmy said, the words precise. "You take 1 cent from my pay, and I won't be the only one who knows it. I'll tell every man on this floor how you squeeze them, and then we'll see who's careless." The foreman blinked, taken aback by the calm, strategic threat. The bluster left him. He muttered something and stalked away. The pay wasn't docked. In that moment, Jimmy Hoffa learned his second great lesson: collective power. A single worker was disposable, but the idea of united workers, even just the whisper of it, was a lever that could move the world. He began to talk to the other stock boys, the truck loaders, the men with broken bodies and dwindling hope. He spoke in the break room not about revolution, but about simple fairness. About the weight of a load, the length of a shift, the number on the pay stub. He had no title, no union card. What he had was a fierce, burning understanding of their shared condition and a voice that, once heard, was impossible to ignore. He organized his first strike at 17. A simple, coordinated work slowdown that brought shipping to a halt for a day. Management, bewildered by the quiet, unified resistance from a bunch of teenagers, caved to their demands for better crates and a 5-minute longer break. When he returned to Detroit a few years later, it wasn't as a defeated boy. It was as a young man with a trade. Not the trade of lifting boxes, but the trade of lifting men. He went to work for a freight dock, and immediately he saw the same patterns, just on a larger, more violent scale. The Teamsters union existed, but it was weak, corrupt, and ignored the rank and file. Goons hired by the companies beat men who complained. The air was thick with fear and diesel fumes. Jimmy didn't just join the Teamsters, he infiltrated it. He stood up at a union meeting, his voice cutting through the smoky apathy. He pointed to the bruise on a fellow dockworker's face. "They sell us insurance for when we get hurt on the job," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "But who's insuring us against the boss's fists? The union should be that insurance. And if it won't be, then we'll build one that will." He was beaten for that speech, left in an alley. But the next day, he was back on the dock, the bruise on his face a badge. Men started to listen. They began to meet in secret in basements and garages. Jimmy Hoffa, barely out of his teens, was drafting the blueprint for a new kind of union, one built not on backroom deals, but on street-level solidarity, on the unshakable belief that the man who moved the freight should have a say in its destination. He was learning that power wasn't given. It was taken piece by piece, load by load, with a stubbornness that could outlast any winter wind. The stage was set not in a boardroom, but on the dirty, dangerous docks of Detroit, and the main actor was a 5'5" bulldog of a man who had decided that the entire economic order of America needed to be repacked, and he was just the guy to do it. The alleyway beating was a graduation of sorts. It taught Jimmy Hoffa that conviction alone was a target painted on your back. You needed leverage. You needed organization. And in the brutal world of 1930s Detroit, you sometimes needed a certain kind of ally to protect your own. He didn't retreat. He worked the docks by day, his eyes missing nothing, which foreman was skimming from the load bonuses, which trucking company was using non-union drivers to undercut rates. By night, he became a phantom organizer. He'd visit workers at their kitchen tables, speaking in low, urgent tones about solidarity. He didn't sell a dream of socialism. He sold a practical product: dignity. A fair day's pay for a backbreaking day's work. Security against arbitrary firing. It was a product every man on the line desperately wanted to buy. His break came not from the union hall, but from a laundry. The laundry drivers, a ragged group of men operating rickety trucks for starvation wages, were being terrorized by their owner. Hoffa heard about it and saw an opportunity. These men weren't part of the powerful freight system, but they were Teamsters, and they were being ground into the dirt. He organized them in secret and then called a strike. It was a tiny, seemingly insignificant action in a city of industrial giants. The laundry owner hired thugs. The first morning of the picket line, a goons club came down on the shoulder of an older driver, breaking his collarbone. The line wavered. Hoffa didn't flinch. He stepped forward, not to fight the thug, but to help the wounded man up. Then he turned to the others, his voice cutting through the panic. "They think one broken bone will break us. They don't know we're made of tougher stuff. Hold the line. Your family is counting on you." But he also made a phone call. He called a man who knew a man who had influence in certain circles. It wasn't a request for violence, but for a conversation. The message delivered to the laundry owner was simple. The cost of hiring muscle to break the strike would soon outweigh the cost of just paying his drivers a living wage. The muscle, ironically, could be applied from both sides. The thugs vanished. Within a week, the laundry owner settled. The drivers got their raise. Word of this small, gritty victory spread. Hoffa hadn't just won a contract. He demonstrated a new formula. Organize first, strike smart, and have the strategic backing to enforce your will. He was proving that even the smallest link in the commercial chain, if organized tightly enough, could bring the whole line to a halt. This brought him to the attention of the existing Teamsters leadership in Detroit, a group led by a man named Tommy Burke. Burke was old school, more interested in cutting deals with management for his own slice than in building worker power. He saw Hoffa as a useful, if dangerous, weapon, a fiery young organizer who could rally the men. He gave Hoffa a formal organizer title and a territory: the city's sprawling produce market. The produce market was chaos. It operated in the dead of night, a shadowy world of independent farmers, ruthless wholesalers, and independent truckers fighting for a load. It was a microcosm of cutthroat capitalism, and it was ripe for Hoffa's style of order. He didn't just sign up drivers. He organized the entire ecosystem. He convinced the loaders, the sorters, even some of the smaller farmers that stability and standardized rates would benefit everyone, except the predatory wholesalers who exploited the chaos. He used every tool. He'd broker peace between warring truckers, earning loyalty. He'd apply subtle pressure on holdouts, a reminder that a truck that couldn't get loaded was a truck that earned nothing. He was part labor leader, part chaotic market regulator. Within a year, the Detroit produce market ran on Hoffa's rules. Efficiency and union membership skyrocketed together. It was here he cemented his lifelong philosophy. He believed the union wasn't just a bargaining agent. It was the owner of the labor, and therefore had the right to control its deployment, to set industry-wide standards. This belief would later become both his greatest strength and his fatal flaw. One evening in 1937, after a marathon negotiating session that won the produce drivers a revolutionary pension plan, Tommy Burke invited Hoffa for a drink. The older man raised his glass. "You got a gift, Jimmy. You see the board when everyone else is just looking at their own piece. But remember, this game is played with partners. Some partners," he said, swirling his whiskey, "aren't listed on the union letterhead." Hoffa understood. He'd already met some of those partners. They were the men who could guarantee a warehouse wasn't mysteriously burned during a strike, who could ensure a truck full of non-union goods never reached its destination. They operated in the spaces the law couldn't touch. Hoffa, the pragmatist, saw them not as criminals, but as a necessary force, another form of leverage in a brutal fight. He made alliances cautiously, always ensuring the union got the better end of the deal. By the end of the 1930s, James R. Hoffa was no longer just a stock boy from Indianapolis. He was a powerhouse in Detroit, a man who had built a personal army of loyal, dues-paying Teamsters. He had learned to wield the threat of economic paralysis with surgical precision. And he had begun to understand that the road to real power for the working man might require walking carefully in the shadows with those who knew how power truly worked in America. The stage was getting bigger, and Jimmy was ready for the spotlight, unaware of how long and dark the shadows he courted would eventually become. The war changed everything, not just the world, but the very nature of work in America. As the 1940s dawned and the nation's industrial machine roared to life to feed the Allied arsenal, Jimmy Hoffa saw a staggering opportunity. The lesson of the produce market, control the choke point, could now be applied to a continent. The choke point was no longer a loading dock in Detroit. It was the American highway itself. Every tank, every plane part, every bullet needed to move by truck. The man who controlled the truck drivers controlled the heartbeat of the war effort. Hoffa, now in his late 20s and leading the powerful Local 299 in Detroit, became a whirlwind of relentless, precise action. He understood that the old, fragmented system of city-by-city unions was obsolete. A trucker hauling artillery shells from Michigan to Virginia passed through half a dozen different union jurisdictions, each with its own rules, its own weak contracts, its own petty bosses. It was inefficient for the war, and it kept drivers poor and powerless. He began a campaign of consolidation that was less a political movement and more a military campaign. He would drive to Cleveland, to Chicago, to St. Louis, not with rhetoric, but with facts and figures. He'd meet with the local union brass, often older men set in their ways. Hoffa, fueled by endless coffee and a burning vision, would lay out maps and ledgers. "See this route," he'd say, his finger tapping a highway line. "Your man drives it. My man drives it. We both get paid different rates for the same miles. The company plays us against each other. But if we sign one contract, a national contract, that truck is ours from start to finish. The driver wins, the union wins, and the country gets its goods without a hitch." He was selling the concept of the National Master Freight Agreement, and he was selling himself as the only man ruthless and smart enough to make it happen. To achieve this, he needed more than just persuasive logic. He needed to win the internal civil war within the Teamsters. The union's presidency was held by Dave Beck, a man from the West Coast who believed in a more genteel, corporate style of labor leadership. Beck was comfortable. Hoffa was hungry. Beck saw the union as a business. Hoffa saw it as an army. Their clash came to a head over the issue of the Central States drivers. Council, a key body that negotiated contracts for the vital Midwest region. Beck wanted it controlled by his loyalists. Hoffa wanted it as the launching pad for his national vision. Using his deep network of loyal local leaders, men he had helped, fought alongside or outmaneuvered, Hoffa staged a quiet coup. He packed the council with his allies, effectively seizing control of the most lucrative and strategic piece of the Union's territory. It was a move of breathtaking political audacity, done not with shouts, but with whispered promises and calculated favors. It was during this period of consolidation that Hoffa's relationship with the other power structure deepened. Organizing the freight industry meant dealing with the owners of the trucking terminals, the warehouses, the parking lots. In many cities, these assets were controlled by men with murky backgrounds and flexible morals. A strike could be broken by hiring non-union scabs. But scabs couldn't unload a truck if the warehouse doors were mysteriously locked, or if the parking lot suddenly required repairs. Hoffa's allies in the underworld provided these services. They were the enforcers of his economic blockades. Hoffa rationalized it. He wasn't partnering with criminals. He was utilizing logistical consultants. The goal was pure, the betterment of the working man. If the tools to achieve that were sometimes rusty and kept in a dark shed, so be it. The moral calculus of the stock boy who'd faced down the foreman was being stretched to its limit. By 1946, the war was over, but Hoffa's war was just beginning. The country was drowning in consumer demand, and the truck was king. At a packed, smoke-filled convention in Chicago, Hoffa stood before the National Brotherhood. He didn't give a speech about solidarity, he gave a report card. He listed the cities consolidated, the contracts unified, the pension funds established. Then he issued a promise, his voice a flat, Midwestern hammer. We are the wheels of this country. Without us, it stops. It's time we got paid like it. Not just wages, dignity, security, a piece of the prosperity we haul on our backs. And to get it, we will be one union, one voice, one fist. The room erupted. He was elected an international vice president of the Teamsters that day. Dave Beck, the sitting president, applauded politely, a cold smile on his face. He knew the balance of power had shifted. The future of the Teamsters was a short, tireless man from Detroit who saw highways as rivers of gold and believed every ounce of that gold belonged to the men behind the wheel. Hoffa left Chicago not with a feeling of triumph, but with a to-do list. The national contract was now within reach. The pension funds he controlled were growing into mountains of capital, and the web of alliances he'd spun, both above and below board, was now a formidable net. He was no longer just a labor leader. He was the CEO of the most powerful transportation company in the world, a company whose shares were held in the calloused hands of 2 million truckers. He was at the peak of his power, and the air up there was thin, cold, and filled with the watchful eyes of rivals, politicians, and federal agents who had begun to document the shadowy sources of his extraordinary strength. The pinnacle was not a place of rest, but a plateau exposed on all sides to the wind. For Jimmy Hoffa, the late 1940s and early 1950s were a period of relentless construction and constant vigilance. He had built a machine of phenomenal power, the Central States Pension Fund. This was no mere retirement account. It was a multi-billion-dollar river of capital, fed by the weekly dues of hundreds of thousands of truckers. Hoffa, who understood the power of leverage better than any Wall Street banker, saw its potential. This money could be the ultimate tool to cement his national contract, to build loyalty, and to reshape American industry itself. He began lending from the fund, not to banks, but to projects, to casinos rising from the Nevada desert, to hotels in Miami, to housing developments and shopping centers. The terms were favorable, the approval process bypassed traditional scrutiny. Hoffa reasoned he was investing union money to create union jobs, construction jobs for the brothers in other trades. But the borrowers were often men with familiar, sharp-featured faces from his own circle of logistical consultants. The lines between building the American dream and enriching a shadowy network became blurred, then invisible. To Hoffa, it was all the same game, using capital to create power and using power to secure the future of his men. This empire building did not go unchallenged. From within the Union, Dave Beck watched with growing alarm. Beck represented the old guard who believed in a more cautious, respectable partnership with corporate America. Hoffa's aggressive lending and his open association with questionable figures were, in Beck's view, a threat to the union's very legitimacy. Their conflict moved from backroom maneuvers to open war. At the 1952 Teamsters convention in Los Angeles, the air was thick with more than cigar smoke. It was charged with the static of impending coup. Beck, still president, had the podium, but Hoffa had the delegates. He had spent years ensuring that the men voting were his men, local leaders who owed their strong contracts and full coffers to him. When Beck gave a speech urging prudence and financial conservatism, the response was tepid. When Hoffa took the floor, not to speak for himself but to nominate a loyal ally for a key vice presidential spot, the hall shook with roaring approval. It was a naked demonstration of raw political strength. Beck retained the presidency, but he was now a king without a kingdom. Hoffa controlled the army. The more dangerous challenge, however, came from outside the Union. A new kind of enemy emerged, one who could not be outmaneuvered in a Union hall or placated with a favorable loan. His name was Robert F. Kennedy. In 1957, Kennedy was appointed chief counsel to the Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in the Labor or Management Field, known as the McClellan Committee. Kennedy was young, fiercely moral, and possessed of a relentless prosecutorial mind. He didn't see Hoffa as a labor leader, but as a corrupt tyrant who had hijacked a union and betrayed the working man. Their first confrontation in the hearing room was electric. Kennedy, with his clean-cut Boston elegance, asked pointed, quiet questions designed to trap. Hoffa, in a sharp suit, his jaw set like granite, responded with a mixture of defiance, memory lapses, and flat denials. He wasn't just testifying. He was performing for his members, showing them he wouldn't be intimidated by some rich kid senator's brother. When Kennedy pressed him on a questionable loan from the pension fund to a Florida real estate developer with known mob ties, Hoffa leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with scornful practicality. "We loaned money to build a hotel. That hotel employed 300 construction workers for 2 years. It now employs 100 people to run it. Their kids eat because of that loan. You talk about connections, I talk about paychecks." It was a compelling argument to the trucker watching at home. But Kennedy was unmoved. He saw a shell game. The hearings dragged on for weeks, then months. Hoffa was in the chair constantly, his every financial transaction, every phone call, every association put under the Klieg lights. The committee exposed the dark underbelly of his alliances. The names of mobsters like Anthony, Tony Pro, Provenzano, and others were spoken into the official record, linked irrevocably to Hoffa and his fund. The pressure was immense, but it forged in Hoffa a kind of paranoid brilliance. He began studying law books at night, preparing for his own defense with the same intensity he once used to organize a loading. He saw the law as just another system to be mastered, another set of rules to be bent to his will. He surrounded himself with sharp, aggressive lawyers. He used every procedural delay, every legal technicality. He wasn't just fighting Kennedy. He was fighting the idea that the government could tell him how to run his union. In 1957, as the hearings reached a fever pitch, Dave Beck was indicted for tax evasion and embezzlement. He was finished. The presidency of the Teamsters was finally within Hoffa's grasp. Yet the victory was bittersweet. He would assume the throne of the most powerful union in the world at the very moment its treasury and its leader were under the most intense scrutiny in American history. Standing on the convention stage in Miami Beach in 1957, accepting the presidency, Hoffa looked out at a sea of delegates. The cheers were deafening, but his smile was tight. He could feel the weight of the gavel in his hand and the weight of Robert Kennedy's gaze from hundreds of miles away in Washington. He had achieved his life's ambition, but the castle he now ruled was surrounded by a new army, one armed with subpoenas and television cameras, led by a man whose zeal matched his own. The fight for the trucker's dignity had become a fight for his own survival. The highway to power had led him directly into the longest, darkest tunnel of his life. The presidency of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters was not an office. It was a fortress under siege. Jimmy Hoffa moved into the Washington, D.C. headquarters in 1958, but his mind was never on the capital's elegant boulevards. It was on two fronts: the sprawling, gritty reality of his union's daily needs, and the pristine paperwork battlefields of the federal justice system. He operated now on two parallel tracks, and the momentum required to keep both moving was superhuman. By day, he was the hands-on CEO of a vast, messy, vital corporation. He crisscrossed the country in a relentless blur, landing in cities to settle a local strike, to strong-arm a recalcitrant trucking firm into a better contract, to deliver a fiery speech to a union hall filled with anxious members. He remembered names, contracts, and grievances with a computer-like recall that stunned both friends and foes. A driver in Kansas City could write to Hoffa about a disputed overtime payment, and weeks later, Hoffa might reference it in a meeting with the company's vice president, settling the matter on the spot. This direct, personal connection to the rank and file was his bedrock. They saw him as their champion, fighting not just companies, but now the government itself. By night, and in every spare moment, he was a defendant, a legal strategist, and a student of jurisprudence. The McClellan Committee had handed off a mountain of evidence to the Justice Department. Indictments followed, not for murder or violence, but for the complex, white-collar crimes Hoffa had always considered the tools of his trade. Wire fraud, mail fraud, jury tampering, and the misuse of union funds. Robert Kennedy, now Attorney General of the United States, made Hoffa his personal obsession. The Get Hoffa squad within the Justice Department was real, well-funded, and relentless. Hoffa met this legal onslaught with the same tactical ferocity he used on a picket line. He hired the best, most aggressive defense lawyers money could buy. He studied case law, often knowing precedents better than junior prosecutors. He viewed each trial not as a search for truth, but as a contest of wills, a game where the rules were meant to be tested at every turn. The first major trial in 1962 was for jury tampering in Nashville. The government alleged Hoffa had attempted to bribe members of a jury in a previous case. It was a classic Kennedy move. Attack not the main crime, but the cover-up. Not the power, but the panic. Hoffa was confident. He had an alibi, witnesses, but the trial revealed the depth of the government's resolve. Witnesses were flipped. Testimony was damning. The legal community held its breath. In the midst of this, Hoffa continued to run the union. He negotiated the first truly national master freight agreement in 1964, a monumental achievement that standardized wages and conditions for over 400,000 drivers. It was the culmination of his life's work. At the signing, surrounded by beaming union officials and grudging industry representatives, he allowed himself a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. The front-page headlines should have been about this historic peace treaty for the American road. But in the newspapers, the story was below the fold. The top story was the ongoing drama of his Nashville trial. The verdict came down, guilty. Hoffa was stunned. He stood ramrod straight as the judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison and levied a hefty fine. The conviction was a body blow, but not a knockout. He immediately appealed, vowing to fight all the way to the Supreme Court. His members rallied. Telegrams of support flooded union headquarters. To them, the conviction was proof positive that the powerful, the corporate bosses and their friends in government, would stop at nothing to destroy the one man who truly scared them. But the fortress walls were cracking. The second track of his life, the legal defense, was consuming everything: time, money, focus. More trials loomed. The appeals process was a slow, grinding torture. The pressure began to warp his judgment. He grew more suspicious, even of longtime aides. His legendary temper, once a controlled tool, flashed more frequently. The constant state of war was changing him. In 1964, another conviction followed, this time for fraud in Chicago, related to the misuse of the Central States Pension Fund. Another 13 years was tacked onto his sentence. The appeals continued, a complex legal trench warfare that stretched on for years. By 1967, the walls finally closed in. The Supreme Court declined to hear his final appeal. The sentences were to be served consecutively, 13 years. He was ordered to report to prison. As he prepared to surrender, he addressed his executive board. There was no defeat in his voice, only a cold, burning instruction. This isn't over. You hold the line. You run this union the way we built it. I'll be back. This is just a detour. On March 7th, 1967, James R. Hoffa, the most powerful labor leader in America, entered the federal prison at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, inmate number 33298. The man who controlled the highways was locked in a cell, his world reduced to a few square feet of concrete. The two tracks of his life had finally collided, and the legal track had won, derailing the other with brutal finality. But in his mind, and in the hearts of millions of Teamsters, the fight was merely in recess. The engine was idling, waiting for the driver to return. The keys, however, were no longer in his pocket. They were in the hands of the men he left behind, and some of them had long dreamed of taking his seat. Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary was not designed to break a man like Jimmy Hoffa. It was designed to contain him, which was a different problem entirely. The routine was a dull, rhythmic hammer. Count, work, eat, count, sleep. For a mind that had orchestrated the movement of a nation's goods, the sheer, mind-numbing inactivity was a unique torture. But Hoffa did not surrender to it. He approached imprisonment as he had every other obstacle, as a logistical challenge to be mastered, a temporary bottleneck in the supply chain of his life. He was assigned to the prison laundry, a steamy, echoing cavern of concrete and machinery. He worked without complaint, folding sheets with the same fierce precision he once used to dissect a freight contract. He listened. The prison was a marketplace of information, gossip, and grievance. Men whispered about appeals, about lawyers, about connections on the outside. Hoffa, the master organizer, began to map the social and power structures of his new world. He knew which guards were susceptible to a favor, which inmates had influence, and which were informants. His real work, however, happened during legal visits and in the flood of mail he was permitted. His mind was not in the laundry. It was on the 25th floor of the Teamsters Marble headquarters in Washington. From his cell, he began a relentless campaign of correspondence and instruction. He wrote detailed letters to the executive board, dictating strategy on contract negotiations. He reviewed financial statements, his eye-catching discrepancies a junior accountant might miss. He was running the union by remote control, a ghost in the machine. This infuriated the government and deeply worried the man he had left in charge, Frank Fitzsimmons. Fitz, a loyal lieutenant from Detroit, had been handpicked by Hoffa as his caretaker president. At first, Fitz played the part of the humble substitute, dutifully visiting Lewisburg to receive his marching orders. But power, even borrowed power, has a sweet and corrosive taste. As Hoffa's legal appeals dragged through the courts with glacial speed, Fitzsimmons began to savor the title, the deference, the ability to make his own decisions. He started to drift. Hoffa sensed it first in the tone of the reports, then in the delays in implementing his instructions. A proposed change to a pension fund investment was being studied. A recalcitrant local leader Hoffa wanted disciplined was instead being mollified. Fitz was building his own alliances, and they were not with the old guard Hoffa trusted. They were with the flashier, more outwardly legitimate elements of the union's periphery, and with certain associates who saw a more pliable figure in Fitzsimmons. The most dangerous shift was in the relationship with the government. Robert Kennedy was gone, assassinated in 1968. The Get Hoffa fervor in the Justice Department had cooled to a bureaucratic simmer. Fitzsimmons, a less threatening, more conciliatory figure, found he could do business with the new administration. Quiet understandings were reached. The relentless federal pressure on the Teamsters eased, provided the union played ball. For Fitz, this was pragmatic survival. For Hoffa, watching from his cell, it was treason. He saw it as Fitz bartering away the union's fierce independence for a comfortable peace with the very forces that had put him, Hoffa, in prison. In 1969, Hoffa received the news that his parole hearing had been denied. The reason cited was his failure to demonstrate rehabilitation and his continued influence over union affairs. The message was clear. As long as he was Jimmy Hoffa, the defiant powerhouse, the gates would stay locked. A cold fury settled in him. They didn't want a reformed man. They wanted a broken one. It was then that a new idea began to form, not of escape, but of negotiation. If the government wanted him to disappear from the Union stage, perhaps a deal could be struck. He began to explore, through his lawyers, the possibility of a commutation, a presidential pardon that would set him free, but under conditions. The condition, he knew, would be his resignation from Union office. It was an unimaginable price, to give up the life's work he was still secretly directing from a cell. But the alternative was to rot in Louisburg while Fitzsimmons dismantled his legacy and gave away the store. The internal conflict tore at him. He wrote to his wife, Josephine, his anchor through every storm. "I built this union with my own 2 hands. It's my life. But my life is in a cage, and the wolves are picking at what I built outside. Do I surrender the crown to save the king?" He began a clandestine campaign, leveraging every connection he had left. He reached out to old political contacts, to businessmen who owed the pension fund favors, even to figures in the underworld who understood the value of a debt. The message was the same: pressure must be applied. The Nixon White House needed to see that letting Jimmy Hoffa out was in everyone's best interest. In his small cell, surrounded by law books and Union files, Hoffa was fighting the most complex battle of his life. He was at war with the government that held him, with his protege who had betrayed him, and with his own colossal pride. The parole denial had shown him the exit was not through the front door by good behavior. It was through a side door, cut by a deal with the devil he knew best: power politics. The question was no longer if he would get out, but what would be left of his kingdom when he did, and what bloody civil war would be required to take it back. The prisoner was plotting his restoration, and the chessboard spanned from the prison yard to the Oval Office. The deal, when it finally came in late 1971, tasted not of victory, but of cold, calculated necessity. It arrived not on celebratory stationery, but through the clipped, precise language of a Justice Department lawyer in a prison meeting room. President Richard Nixon had commuted Jimmy Hoffa's sentence. He would be released on December 23, 1971. But the commutation came with a condition, a single monumental restriction penned into the legal order. James R. Hoffa was barred from engaging in any union activity until 1980. He could not hold office, influence elections, or participate in union management in any way. Hoffa sat across the table, his hands flat on the scarred wood. He had known this would be the price. He had spent months rationalizing it, telling himself it was just a tactical retreat, a timeout. He would get out, regroup, use his freedom to maneuver, to rally his people, and when the ban expired, he would reclaim what was his. But hearing the words aloud, seeing them typed on official paper, was a different kind of sentence. They were cutting the engine of his life and telling him he could only watch it coast. He signed. What choice did he have? Louisburg was a tomb. Outside, there was at least air and movement and possibility. The release was a media circus. Cameras flashed as he walked out of the prison gates into the brittle winter sunlight, squinting, a free man for the first time in nearly 5 years. He made a brief statement, thanking the president, expressing his love for his family and the union members. His voice was firm, but his eyes held a guarded distance. He was playing a part now, the rehabilitated citizen. The return home to Detroit was a whirlwind of private emotion and public silence. He hugged his wife, Josephine, and his children, the simple, profound act feeling strange after years of stiff, supervised visits. His house was familiar, yet everything in it seemed smaller, quieter, a museum of a life paused. The silence was the first thing he noticed. The phone, which had once been a live wire crackling with the urgency of a continent, was now largely still. The men who had once called him daily for decisions now hesitated. It was Frank Fitzsimmons's world. Fitz had not only settled into the presidency, he had remodeled it in his own image, softer, more corporate, more willing to cut quiet deals with both corporate America and the government. The Hoffa men on the executive board were now a minority, marginalized, or co-opted. Hoffa's legal team interpreted the commutation restrictions with paranoid strictness. He could not enter Teamster headquarters. He could not call union officials to discuss union business. He was a ghost in his own legacy. His only permissible connection to his life's work was through the press. He began giving interviews, writing op-eds. He spoke in broad terms about labor's future and the dignity of the working man, but everyone reading between the lines knew he was talking about the Teamsters, and everyone knew he was criticizing Fitzsimmons's leadership as weak as a surrender. This was his new battlefield, the court of public opinion, fought through newspapers and television screens. He was trying to speak directly over Fitzsimmons's head to the rank-and-file trucker, to remind them who had built their pensions, who had won the national contract, who had gone to prison fighting for them. It was a frustrating, nebulous fight. He was used to issuing orders and seeing trucks move. Now, he issued critiques and waited to see if editorials shifted. The most dangerous developments, however, were happening in the shadows he knew all too well. The alliances he had forged with certain associates had been maintained and deepened by Fitzsimmons, but with a crucial difference. Fitz was not a partner, he was a client. He allowed these associates greater access to the union's financial levers, the pension fund loans, the insurance contracts, in exchange for their political support and a steady flow of consulting fees. The delicate, often tense balance of power Hoffa had maintained was gone, replaced by a more straightforward and more corrosive patronage system. Hoffa learned of this through the old, secret channels that even prison couldn't fully sever. A trusted friend would visit, not talking union business, of course, but sharing news of mutual friends. Hoffa heard names. Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano, a powerful New Jersey Teamster boss with known mafia ties, was now a key Fitzsimmons ally. Others from Detroit, Chicago, Kansas City, men Hoffa had used but kept at arm's length, were now embedded in the union's upper echelons. They had supported Fitz's rise, and they expected their loyalty to be repaid with influence and access. To Hoffa, this was the ultimate betrayal. He had consorted with these forces, yes, but always as the dominant partner, always with the union's interest, as he defined it, paramount. Fitz was letting the fox not just guard the henhouse, but redesign it. The union's soul, its purpose, was being auctioned off. A deep, restless anger began to burn in him. The legal ban chafed like a shackle. He started to test its boundaries. He would have social lunches with old allies where union politics was inevitably discussed. He began to quietly, very quietly, reach out to local leaders he knew were still loyal, sounding them out, gauging their discontent with Fitzsimmons. He was planting seeds, hoping for a harvest in 1980, when the ban would lift. But 1980 was 8 years away. To the men now enjoying the fruits of Fitzsimmons's permissive reign, 8 years was an eternity. And a comeback by the fiercely independent, notoriously demanding Jimmy Hoffa was a threat to their entire arrangement. They had grown comfortable. They had built their own empires within his. The thought of him returning, scrutinizing the books, reclaiming control of the pension fund, and dismantling their deals was unacceptable. Jimmy Hoffa walked the streets of Detroit a free man, but he was in a new kind of prison, one of irrelevance and simmering fury. He could see the kingdom he built, but its gates were guarded by his own former lieutenant and a new set of sentries who viewed him not as a returning king, but as a dangerous ghost from a past they had profitably buried. The fight was no longer about contracts or pensions. It was about legacy, power, and survival. And for the first time, the odds were not in the stubborn stock boy's favor. The battlefield had shifted beneath his feet, and the rules of engagement had turned deadly. The year 1972 bled into 1973, and for Jimmy Hoffa, time became a tangible enemy. Each passing day was a grain of sand in an hourglass counting down to 1980, but the landscape around him was shifting faster than the calendar. His social lunches with old allies evolved into something more structured, though never documented. He began holding what he called strategy sessions at a small, unmarked office he rented in a nondescript building in downtown Detroit. It wasn't Teamsters business, he told himself and his lawyers. It was political consulting for the labor movement at large. The fiction was thin, but it was a necessary cloak. The men who came were the remnants of his old guard. Local presidents from the Midwest who remembered the glory days of militant contracts. A few loyalists from the international staff who had been sidelined by Fitzsimmons. They sat in worn chairs, drinking coffee from paper cups, and listened as Hoffa paced. He had maps of the country on the wall, not of highways, but of union jurisdictions. He was analyzing the board like a general planning a reconquest. Fitz is letting the standards crumble, Hoffa would say, his finger jabbing at the map. He's making side deals with carriers in the South, undercutting the national agreement. He's letting the pension fund be used as a piggy bank for Vegas and Miami, not for our members' retirement. We have to document it. We have to be ready. He tasked his loyalists with gathering information. Copies of suspect loan agreements from the pension fund, memos showing sweetheart deals for certain trucking companies, evidence of no-show jobs given to relatives of Fitzsimmons's new allies. Hoffa was building a dossier not for a courtroom, he was done with those, but for the court of the union membership. When the ban lifted, he would unveil it all, a devastating indictment of Fitzsimmons's betrayal. But the other side was not idle. Frank Fitzsimmons was no longer the hesitant understudy. He had grown into his role, enjoying the trappings of power and the peace he'd brokered with the government. Hoffa's quiet campaign of criticism was a nuisance, a buzzing fly, but the reports he received about Hoffa's strategy sessions were something more. They were the unmistakable sound of a gathering storm. Fitzsimmons's allies, particularly those with deeper, darker connections, viewed Hoffa's activities not as politics, but as a direct threat to a very profitable status quo. The most volatile of these allies was Tony Pro Provenzano, the head of New Jersey's Teamsters Local 560. Tony Pro was everything Hoffa despised in the New Order. A brazen, violent man who ruled his local with an iron fist and was widely understood to be a key figure in the Genovese crime family. He had supported Fitzsimmons lavishly, and in return, his influence over union affairs in the Northeast and over certain pension fund investments had grown immense. To Tony Pro, Hoffa wasn't a legend. He was a loose end, a hard-headed former boss who didn't understand how the game had changed. A message was sent to Hoffa through an intermediary. It was not a threat, but a suggestion from Tony Pro. Perhaps Jimmy should think about enjoying his retirement. He had his health, his family. He should consider a permanent vacation, maybe in Florida. The pension fund could even provide a generous consultant's pension to make it comfortable. The message was clear. Step aside gracefully and be rewarded. Keep agitating and there would be consequences. Hoffa's response was pure, unadulterated Hoffa. He was furious. He saw it as an attempt by a glorified thug to buy him off, to pension him out of his own life's work. He refused the offer, and worse, he began to openly criticize Tony Pro in his circles, calling him a cancer on the union. The war was no longer just with Fitzsimmons. It was now with the dangerous machinery Fitzsimmons had allowed to infiltrate the union's core. In the summer of 1975, the tension snapped into public view at the Teamsters National Convention in Las Vegas. Hoffa, banned from the floor as a delegate, was nonetheless in the city. He held a press conference in a hotel suite, surrounded by a handful of loyalists. He denounced the convention as a rubber stamp for corruption and accused Fitzsimmons of selling out the members. It was a direct public challenge. Fitzsimmons, presiding over the convention hall filled with his supporters, was livid. The press coverage was a humiliation. After the convention, the private warnings to Hoffa ceased. The tone of the communications from the other side shifted. The intermediaries stopped talking about sunny retirements. The conversations became shorter, colder. The last message, relayed by a nervous go-between, was stark. Tell Jimmy to be careful. The road he's on has a dead end. Back in Detroit, Hoffa dismissed it as bluster. He was Jimmy Hoffa. He had faced down the federal government and served his time. He wasn't afraid of Tony Pro or any of Fitzsimmons's hoodlum friends. If anything, their hostility proved he was right, that he was getting close. He redoubled his efforts. He set a meeting for July 30th, 1975, at a restaurant called the Machu's Red Fox in Bloomfield Township, a suburb of Detroit. He was to meet with two men, a local Teamster official and, he believed, Anthony Provenzano's brother, Salvatore Sally Bugs Bergoglio. Hoffa thought this could be a chance to talk sense, to negotiate, or at least to size up the opposition directly. On the afternoon of July 30th, he put on a fresh suit. He told his wife he had a business meeting and would be back for dinner. He was energized, the old fire in his gut. This was action. This was the fight. He was going to meet the enemy on neutral ground. As he walked out the door, he was not a man stepping into an abyss, but a general walking onto what he believed was the next battlefield in his long war for control. The clock was ticking towards 1980, but the sands were about to run out far, far sooner. The strategy session was over. The endgame had begun. The clock on the kitchen wall of the Hoffa home in Lake Orion, Michigan, ticked past 7 p.m., then 8 p.m. The dinner Josephine Hoffa had prepared sat cooling on the stove. The familiar anxiety that had been her companion for decades, through strikes, trials, and imprisonment, tightened its grip, but now it was laced with a new, chilling specificity. Jimmy was never late for dinner, not when he said he'd be there. It was a point of pride with him, a small anchor of normality in their turbulent life. She called the few numbers she had for his close associates. The responses were variations on a theme. They hadn't seen him. They didn't know about a meeting at the Machu's Red Fox. Their voices held a careful, guarded neutrality that made her heart pound harder. By 10 p.m., she called the Oakland County Sheriff's Office. The officer who took the report was polite but not overly concerned. "A lot of times, these things resolve themselves, ma'am. He's a busy man. We'll put out an alert." But it didn't resolve itself. The next morning, July 31st, Hoffa's dark green Pontiac Granville was found in the restaurant parking lot. It was unlocked, empty. There was no sign of a struggle. It was as if he had simply evaporated between the driver's seat and the restaurant door. The sight of the abandoned car, reported by a local news crew, transformed the story from a missing persons bulletin into a national sensation. The FBI entered the case quickly. Jimmy Hoffa was not just anyone. He was a figure of immense historical and legal significance. Agents fanned out across Detroit. They interviewed the restaurant staff. No one remembered seeing Hoffa inside. They tracked down the two men he was supposed to meet. Both had alibis. They claimed the meeting had been canceled, that Hoffa never showed. Their stories were smooth, rehearsed. The agents knew they were lying, but lies are not evidence. Josephine and the Hoffa children were plunged into a surreal nightmare. The phone rang incessantly, reporters, well-wishers, cranks. The driveway was lined with television news vans. Their satellite antennas pointed accusingly at the quiet suburban house. The family put on a brave, unified front, appealing for information, but in private, a devastating helplessness set in. The man who had always fought, who had always been a force of nature, had been neutralized not in a public battle, but in a silent, private vanishing. The investigation became a labyrinth of dead ends and ominous shadows. The FBI uncovered the tensions. The bitter feud with Frank Fitzsimmons, the deadly rivalry with Anthony Provenzano, the millions of dollars in pension funds that flowed through a network of questionable loans. They knew the meeting at the Machu's Red Fox was a setup, a lure. They identified cars seen in the area that afternoon, linked to known associates of organized crime. They had theories, strong ones, but theories are not convictions. The most painful aspect was the silence. In the world Hoffa had inhabited, disputes were often settled with finality, but they usually left a marker. A rumor, a boast, a body left as a grim message. This was different. This was absolute erasure. It sent a more terrifying message than any violence. That Jimmy Hoffa could be made to disappear without a trace. His voice, his will, his very presence subtracted from the world as if he had never existed. It was the ultimate demonstration of power over a man who had built his life on demonstrating power. As weeks turned into months, the frantic search cooled into a permanent, open case file. The news vans eventually left Lake Orion. The Hoffa family was left with the silence, the unanswered phone, and the crushing absence at the head of the table. The union moved on. Frank Fitzsimmons solidified his control, his reign unchallenged. The powerful interests Hoffa had threatened breathed easier, but the mystery itself took on a life of its own. It became an American folklore, a riddle wrapped in the mid-century myths of unions, mobsters, and corruption. Every few years, a new tip would emerge, a deathbed confession, a claim of buried remains under a giant stadium concrete pour, a theory about a Florida swamp, or a Michigan gravel pit. Each led to a flurry of headlines, excavations, and inevitable disappointment. The truth of what happened in the hours after 2:30 p.m. on July 30th, 1975, retreated into the realm of whispers and shadows, known only to a few men who took the secret to their own graves. Jimmy Hoffa, the boy who organized the Stock Boys, the man who unified a nation's truckers, the prisoner who wouldn't break, had embarked on his final unknowable journey. He left behind not a legacy of answers, but a monument of questions. A permanent hollow space in the story of American power, a vanishing that proved, in the end, to be the most powerful and lasting fact of all. The fighter had finally met a fight from which there was no return, no press conference, no appeal. Just the endless, echoing silence of the Michigan afternoon. The world moved on as it always does. The 1970s gave way to the 1980s, the year 1980 itself. The date that had loomed so large in Jimmy Hoffa's mind as the end of his exile came and went without fanfare. In the offices of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, new faces occupied the old chairs. Frank Fitzsimmons eventually passed the presidency to others, and the union continued its complex life, navigating a changing America where trucking deregulation and global competition began to erode the once unshakable fortress Hoffa had built. But the absence of James Riddle Hoffa was not a void that filled in quietly. It became a permanent feature of the American landscape, a haunting. For his family, the agony of not knowing morphed into a lifelong ache, a wound that could never scar over because there was no body to bury, no closure to ritualize. They held memorial services, erected plaques, but these were gestures against a ghost. The man who had filled every room he entered with his formidable presence had left behind a silence that was louder than any of his speeches. For law enforcement, the Hoffa case became the ultimate cold case, a frustrating monument to impenetrable secrecy. The FBI file grew to thousands of pages, a tapestry of leads, rumors, and dead ends. They knew the why with reasonable certainty. Hoffa's determination to reclaim power threatened a vast, lucrative, and dangerous status quo that blended union officials with organized crime. He was a man who knew too much and was too stubborn to be bought off or scared off. His elimination was a business decision. The how and the where remained locked in what investigators call omerta in stereo, the layered silence of both the underworld and the Union Brotherhood. Men who might have talked died, often violently. Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano, the prime suspect in orchestrating the disappearance, went to his own grave in 1988, having said nothing. Others linked to that day in Detroit met similar fates, their secrets buried with them. The most enduring legacy of Hoffa's vanishing was not in the Union Hall, but in the American imagination. He became a cultural ghost, a name synonymous with unexplained disappearance. Comedians told jokes about him appearing at this or that location. His name was invoked in movies and novels as shorthand for the dark side of the labor movement. The endless speculation that he was encased in concrete, fed through a trash compactor, buried in a remote field, said less about Hoffa and more about the public's fascination with the idea that in modern America, a figure of such colossal stature could be made to vanish without a trace. It was a chilling counterpoint to the era of television and celebrity. Proof that the old, dark rules still applied in the shadows. For the rank-and-file Teamster, the old-timer who remembered the fiery organizer who fought for the national contract, Hoffa's end was a tragic, cautionary finale. He was a reminder of the peril that came with too much power and of the dangerous company that power sometimes kept. The better wages, the pensions, the dignity he won for them were real and lasting. But the price, etched in his mysterious fate, was also part of his legacy. He was a complex hero, flawed, defiant, corrupt in some ways, brilliantly effective in others, and ultimately consumed by the very forces he had tried to harness. Decades later, the official case remains open, though active investigation has long since ceased. Periodically, a new book or a televised special will claim a breakthrough, often based on the account of an aging, compromised source. Law enforcement will dutifully follow up, sometimes digging up a field or draining a pond. The results are always the same: nothing. And so, Jimmy Hoffa endures not as a body in the ground, but as a question mark. He is the man who walked out of his house on a summer afternoon to meet the consequences of his own unbending will and never walked back in. The struggle that defined his life, the war for control, ended not with a surrender or a victory, but with an erasure so complete it defeated even his legendary stubbornness. The fighter who never quit was finally stopped by the one opponent you cannot outlast, outsmart, or negotiate with: absolute, utter silence. His story doesn't end with a period, but with an ellipsis, trailing off into the unknown, a permanent footnote in the history of American power, a ghost in the machine of the very highways he once commanded. Time, which Jimmy Hoffa had always fought against, which he had tried to outpace with relentless action, finally had its way. It smoothed the sharp edges of the immediate crisis, blurred the faces of the suspects, and layered dust over the frantic search files. But time could not do what everyone quietly hoped it would: provide an answer. The mystery of July 30th, 1975, hardened into a permanent, immutable fact of history. For the Hoffa family, life adapted to a painful new shape. The phone in Lake Orion eventually stopped ringing with tips or taunts. The driveway cleared of reporters. The world's attention, so fiercely focused on Jimmy for decades, moved on to other scandals, other tragedies. His wife, Josephine, and his children were left in a quiet house, surrounded by the artifacts of a monumental life: awards, photos with presidents, honorary keys. To cities that now felt like exhibits in a museum dedicated to a ghost. They mourned without a grave, sought justice without a crime scene. Their private loss was forever entangled with a public spectacle they could never control. Within the Teamsters union, Hoffa's shadow was both long and faint. New generations of drivers knew his name as a legend, a symbol of a more muscular, fearsome era of labor power. They benefited from the national contracts and pension funds he built, even as those institutions were gradually reformed, regulated, and challenged by a changing economy. The leadership that followed, while never forgetting the lessons of his reign, operated in a different world, one of lawyers, public relations, and political action committees, not of street-level showdowns and secret alliances. The fortress he built still stood, but the drawbridge was up, and the surrounding moat was patrolled by federal monitors. The federal pursuit of the truth continued in fits and starts, a stubborn bureaucratic echo of Robert Kennedy's old crusade. Every few years, a new prosecutor or a dedicated FBI agent would reopen the file, chasing a fresh lead from a dying informant or a technological advance in forensics. Each time, the same wall was hit: the code of silence. The men who knew the specifics were criminals for whom betrayal meant a death sentence, or were themselves dead, their secrets rotting with them. The Justice Department secured convictions for other crimes: racketeering, extortion, against figures like Anthony Provenzano, but the question of Hoffa's fate remained officially and maddeningly open. And so, Jimmy Hoffa achieved a final, paradoxical kind of immortality. He became an American myth, a folktale for the modern age. His name was no longer just that of a labor leader. It was a byword for disappearance itself. He was the punchline to a million jokes about concrete and landfills, a spectral figure rumored to be spotted in unlikely places. This cultural ghost was a far cry from the complex, flesh and blood man, the brilliant strategist, the devoted family man, the ruthless power broker, the defiant prisoner. The myth simplified him, sanding off the rough, human contradictions, turning him into a symbol. But perhaps that symbolic end is the one he would have understood the least, yet the one that speaks the most powerfully to his legacy. Jimmy Hoffa believed in tangible things, in contracts you could hold, in dollars in a pay envelope, in the weight of a gavel in your hand. His entire life was a battle for control of the tangible world. His vanishing was the ultimate loss of that control. It proved that the forces he danced with, the dark side of ambition, the corrosive allure of absolute power, could ultimately consume even the most willful of men. He did not leave behind a body, but he left behind a warning about the cost of power bought with compromised morals. A warning about the fragility of even the most fearsome reputation when it challenges entrenched, shadowy interests. and a warning that in the struggle between a man and the systems he tries to master, sometimes the system doesn't play by any rules at all. The story of James R. Hoffa does not end with a period or even with a definitive tombstone. It ends with a question mark that hangs over the landscape of American power, over the quiet suburbs of Detroit, the marble halls of Washington, and the endless highways where the trucks still run. He is gone, but the silence he left behind is, in its own way, as loud and as lasting as his once roaring voice. The fighter finally met a fight where there was no one to confront, no deal to be made, no union to rally. In the end, the most powerful man in the world of labor was defeated not by a person, but by a perfect, impenetrable, and enduring mystery.